Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagan, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to the third of our summer virtual book talks. Before we begin this afternoon's program, I want to thank the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today, I'm very glad to introduce my colleague, Daniel Carpenter, the Allie S. Freed Professor of Government in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Faculty Director of the Social Sciences Program at Radcliffe. Dan's groundbreaking research applies historical, theoretical, and mathematical approaches to analyze the development of political institutions, with particular attention to public bureaucracies, petitioning systems, and government regulation in North America. Dan led the establishment of the Digital Archive of Anti-Slavery and Anti-Segregation Petitions and the Digital Archive of Native American Petitions in Massachusetts. And his publications include the award-winning book, Reputation and Power, Organizational Image and Pharmaceutical Regulation at the FDA. This afternoon, Dan will discuss his most recent book, Democracy by Petition, Popular Politics and Transformation, 1790 to 1870, which explores what Dan has described as that era's flourishing culture of deeply democratized petitioning. Dan examines not only the unprecedented volume of petitions, but also the ways in which petitioning shaped democracy by providing the means for people who were then shut out of formal politics to express their views. We'll begin our program with a brief reading, after which Dan will engage in conversation with Nikki M. Taylor, who is Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Howard University. Nikki is an expert in 19th century African-American history, and her books include Driven Toward Madness, The Fugitive Slave, Margaret Garner, and Tragedy on the Ohio, and America's First Black Socialist, The Radical Life of Peter H. Clark. I'm delighted to have both Dan and Nikki here today. Following Dan and Nikki's conversation, we'll turn to audience questions. You can use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time. And now it's my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Dan Carpenter.
Greetings. I'm going to read 3 petitions and then an excerpt from the preface. Petition number 1, the Innu First Nation of Canada, 1847. Ka chija uchimawin, takuikan ka itukuin. In the powerful words of an enduring language, on April 8th, 1847, at the Moon of the Geese, on the northern shore of the great seaward flow of North America's Dawnland, did 6 chiefs and 125 other men of the Innu Nation address the Governor General of Canada. "O great chief, who we call the captain of the ship of state," they wrote, "we the Indians of Tadoussac, of the Îles of Jérémie, of the Godebout River, and of Sept-Îles, salute you respectively." The Innu had come to the governor with complaints and requests. They began to make their case. For a long time now, the province has derived its annual revenues from our lands, by the commercial posts as much as by wood stocking, and thereby our hunting grounds have vanished in conversion to farming. And still we have received absolutely no compensation. Thus we are thrown back into the forests. Soon we will not even have a river in which to cast our nets. We will vanish like the sand carried by the wind if you do not take up our cause. We have learned now that new settlers are coming to stay on our productive lands. If you want us to be able to live, we are going to let you know what we think. We ask that you reserve to us the land stretching from the Utard River, including its 2 banks, all the way to the Betsiamis River, including its 2 banks as well, and that you leave us with exclusive rights to fish in the Utard River and the Papinichois and the Great and Small Escumen and the Mistassini and the Betsy and the Romaine and the Betsiamis, and that finally you give us indemnities for the lands that the whites occupy in our homeland, and we will be satisfied. If, on the other hand, you give us nothing, we will soon resemble those dead of hunger. The Innu Petition of 1847, followed by 7 others, thrust the plight of the St. Lawrence's indigenous communities on the colonial agenda. In 1850 and 1851, the government created a series of reserves totaling 230,000 acres, some of which persist to this day. Petition number 2, 6 women of Jefferson County, New York, 1846. The present government of this state, they wrote, has widely departed from the true democratic principles on which all just governments must be based by denying to the female portion of the community the right of suffrage and any participation in forming the government and laws under which they live. And just to read the accompanying text, 8 months before 6 Innu chiefs in their nation had appealed to Canada, 6 women sat down at a table in a town hundreds of miles upstream on the St. Lawrence in Jefferson County, New York, and composed a radical proposal to the New York Constitutional Convention, 2 years, by the way, before the Seneca Falls Declaration. Reminding the convention of the proper form of civil government, Eleanor Vincent, Susan Ormsby, Lydia A. Williams, Amy Ormsby, Lydia Osborne, and Anna Bishop contrasted the status quo in New York State with that of a proper democracy. All governments must derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, they wrote in August 1846. But, quoting the celebrated James Madison, they argue that the governed must be composed from the great body of society and not from a favored class, even though that favored class may be a majority of the inhabitants. Petition number 3. The colored free and freed citizens, as they called themselves, of Savannah, Georgia in 1865. We complain our chief executive of causing by his agents an indulgence of outlaws, much of the outrages and murders that have been committed on loyal subjects and citizens in the Union in the 10 rebel states since May 29, 1865. We charge President Johnson with giving aid and comfort to outlaws. We charge him with usurping legislative and judicial power. We charge him with wickedly and boldly striving to reproduce rebellion by making rebel outlaws governors, judges, sheriffs, mayors, clerks, and the police of the 10 rebel states. This document, mixing humility with audacity, at once meticulous yet coursing with rage, this petition of Asa Cotton, James Hewitt, Aaron Bradley, William Brown, Ishmael Palmer, and dozens of other men of color from Savannah arrived at the U.S. House of Representatives in the autumn of 1865, walking their readers through a list of offenses, interspersing newspaper cuttings freely among their handwritten arguments to provide ready evidence for their claims, referring abundantly to constitutional clauses and to statutes. They laid out the case for President Andrew Johnson's impeachment. The offenses alleged against Johnson by Savannah's black men were comparable in some sense, and yet far worse in other ways, to those launched by one Thomas Jefferson at King George III in 1776. Having usurped powers not his, having failed to enforce laws passed by Congress, having aided an enemy and in so doing plausibly committing treason, having encouraged a rebellion, having acted in ways murderous and wicked, Johnson deserved removal at minimum. The Savannah Freedmen's Prayer reads as part memorial, part indictment list for a capital trial. It was possibly the first and certainly the most radical in a slew of petitions advocating for Johnson's impeachment that would arrive to Congress between 1865 and 1867. Democracy and petition are concepts that seem at first glance utterly unfit for each other. Democracy proclaims the people as sovereign, its constituent citizens as equals. Those who rule in a representative democracy do so by holding offices to which citizens alone elect them, or for many administrators and judges having been appointed by the elected. Democratic government derives its authority from laws passed by those elected officials. Petitioning, on the other hand, evokes a humble approach on bended knee to a ruler, in the pre-modern notion, usually a monarch, asking for something only the sovereign can grant. So conceived, the petition seems to presume a form of abasement, the supplicant rendered as subject, every aspiration converted into a meek request whose fulfillment is a matter of the ruler's whim. For much of a century, though, and I invite you to examine the graphs that I'm now about to show you, petitioning and democracy ran together as never before and never since. In 19th century North America, petitioning became truly explosive and starkly radical. It became more democratic in its aspirations, its proliferating masses of signatures, and its connection of one petition to another in the architecture of a campaign. Petitioning had broken from the monarchical model of supplication before, especially during the American Revolution, but never with such audacity or with such scale. Few corners of the continent's far-flung populations appear to have been untouched by this revolution. From indigenous villages in the St. Lawrence Valley and from pueblos in Nuevo Mexico, from women and men of color in Barbados and Trinidad, and from Black communities in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, from tenant farmers and from urban artisans, from politicians like Thomas Jefferson, Henry Clay, Louis-Joseph Papineau, and William Lyon Mackenzie, from 8-year-old boys and 12-year-old female canvassers, and from aging widows who wanted to vote. From these and from thousands of other authors, petitions, both individual and collective, surged. The democracy portrayed in Democracy by Petition is not our mother's democracy or our father's democracy or our own. Yet it might have been our ancestors' democracy some 5 or 10 generations back. The story of American democratization we have been taught is not false. It is one of revolutions, assemblies. It is one of legislatures, the torturous evolution of voting rights for men, for African Americans, and then for women, the organization of mass parties, the abolition of slavery, the enshrining of civil equality in constitutional text. An appreciation of petitioning, however, deepens and changes this story in some fundamental ways. First, very crucial dimensions of democratization, the expansion of suffrage rights, the empowering of representative bodies, the freeing of lands from feudal tenure, the abolition of slavery, and the expansion of civil rights and preliminary equality. These accomplishments depended as much on petitioning campaigns as on voting in parties themselves. In these developments, petitioning shifted agendas and coordinated popular pressure. Petitions helped bring us the hallmarks of the democracy we know. Second, much of the development of organized civil society in America, the fundaments of the democracy that Alexis de Tocqueville saw and admired in voluntary associations, much of that too happened by petition. In a virtuous cycle, petitioning campaigns were often sponsored by organizations, which themselves may have been started by petitions for incorporation or of protest. Time and again in the antebellum period, petitioning campaigns left organizational legacies, including the building blocks of new political parties, such as the Liberty Party or the Free Soil Party or even the Whig Party, that were far larger and more capacious than the groups that had initially sponsored those petitions. Third, the petitioning authors of democratization encompass peoples and places different from those centered in customary narratives. These different peoples include not only American free Black communities, but also women and men of color in the British West Indies, whose activity alarmed slaveholding interests in the American South. The different peoples include thousands of petitioning indigenous women and men who reshaped legislative and bureaucratic agendas from Canada through Massachusetts to New York to the Great Lakes to Mexico and the Pacific Coast. The different peoples include hundreds of thousands of women who revolutionized the petition canvas and seeded many thousands of deliberative conversations on indigenous dispossession, slavery, war and imperialism, temperance, and the rights of their sex. And the different peoples of this story also inhabited different spaces, including those outside the boundaries and sovereignties of the United States. They include French Canadians who deposed a powerful colonial governor and whose activity inspired the English Chartists, American settlers in what is now Ontario, Canada, alliances of Pueblo natives, Geniceros, and Hispanos in Nuevo Mexico, Catholic women during Mexico's La Reforma, men and women of color in the Caribbean, and men and women in indigenous villages across the continent. And finally, a more democratic reading of petitions, interpreting petitions as alliances and organizations emergent on paper. That reading permits a rereading of those who already have figured in our accounts of democratization. Henry Clay, Louis-Joseph Papineau, and Robert Gourlay built the fundaments of new opposition parties in part through petitioning campaigns. The views of leaders and the agendas of leaders, ranging from Thomas Jefferson to Abraham Lincoln, were shaped and reshaped by democratic petitioning campaigns. William Lloyd Garrison, Angelina Grimke, Maria Stewart, and many others harnessed petitioning to build a multiracial coalition behind the immediate abolition of slavery. City artisans and distant farmers united in signing for tariff protection and anti-monopoly initiatives. The petitioning campaigns of Black and Indigenous peoples were highly successful, not least because they successfully courted white allies. The inseparability of petitioning and democratization forms the central work of this book, Democracy by Petition. Unpacking that claim necessitates thinking of democracy not only as institutions of voting and parties, but also as a work of agendas, of dialogue between government and citizen, of civic organizations, and even of cultural transformation. It also requires a modernization in how we regard the petition, as only in part the supplication of yesteryear, but also a modern technology of text and testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was a beautiful introduction to, what was a profoundly important book. I really enjoyed it. I think the depth and the breadth of the topics, these petition topics, is impressive and also pleasantly exhausting at the same time, nearly 500 pages. It really also showcases your skills and historical dexterity across several fields, not just US history, but the entirety of North America, the languages in these records, English, French, Spanish, indigenous languages, and all the topics you just mentioned. How did you choose this topic for this project, and what influenced or informed your decision to just go ahead and cover the entire North American continent?
Thanks, Nikki. Let me just first say again, I'm such a big fan of your work. I haven't said that yet in this con, but I'm such a big fan of your work, and it's an honor that you're here with me today. I came to Harvard and I started my political science career as a scholar of bureaucracy. Agencies like the US Department of Agriculture, the Department of Interior, the Post Office, the Food and Drug Administration. And one of the things, as I was spending so much time in the archives, working on those agencies and their histories and their development, I just noticed so many petitions. And the customary way I had been taught to think about petitions was as part of a social movement. And I think that's an important way to regard petitions, but I don't think we should reduce petitioning campaigns to social movements or vice versa. And so let me emphasize that the first way I came to this book is just by seeing just this mass of petitions, having conversations with archivists who would tell me about tens of thousands of petitions or petitions with tens of thousands of signatures in their archives that in some cases nobody had studied. In some cases people had studied, but only as part of a particular movement and not as part of a broader development of a petitioning culture in North America. as I began to dig into these petitions, I began to see just petition after petition from Indigenous people. And that's what made me realize I needed to consult with a lot of Native scholars, scholars of Native American politics and history, and many Native communities themselves to help interpret these. The book really represents just the start. And finally, you know, this is, I'll admit, a book that can probably only be written with academic tenure and the time and the security and the capacity or the license, if you will, for risk-taking that it provides. As I began to look into the petitioning of Canada in the 1820s, I saw both from Indigenous peoples and then from the French Canadiens who you know, authored that roughly 90,000 signature petition in 1827, activity that rivaled in its scope anything that I saw in the United States. And that led me to think, wait a minute, what we call Jacksonian democracy, this kind of, you know, push of the people entry, it wasn't just, you know, workers and artisans in major American cities. It was people outside the sovereignties and boundaries of the United States. And then I read your great book on, you know, Cincinnati. And I read, you know, these stories of Native Americans petitioning. And I began to realize that there was a much wider current of democracy going on here.
And that's what I really loved, is that there were so many voices of people who have been historically marginalized or disempowered or dispossessed. And I really appreciated that. Let's get into the archive for a little bit. In your archive is deep and wide. Tell us about your most exciting archival discovery and how it might have changed the game for you.
Oh boy, that's a tough one. Can I choose just one? Let me, as I'm saying this, I really need to acknowledge the Radcliffe Institute and Harvard generally. That's you know, Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean Elizabeth Cohen, the Radcliffe Academic Ventures Group, who really worked with me to invest a lot of resources into anti-slavery, anti-segregation petitions, some of the first petitions signed by Black people in North America, Native American petitions. I was really assisted by the investments that people and the resources at Harvard and Radcliffe especially made possible. I'll say two. I'm going to take the license of saying two. I was in the Tennessee Library and Archives, and I came across a manuscript written by John Ross. And it was right after the Treaty of New Eshota had been finalized, and you know, the ejection of his people from their ancestral spaces was all but certain. And he wrote with bitterness in an essay that he sketched out but never contrasted, called The Contrast. And it contrasted the way that Native Americans received, and in his understanding, helped the Quakers who came to their to Native Americans when they arrived in the colonies and appealed for aid. That moment, with another much less holy moment, when the Cherokee petitioned by the thousands, often in the Sequoia syllabary, and basically asked for protection for their ancestral lands and did not receive it. And it just was, you know, John Ross has been written about, you know, so many, Claudio Sant's work and so many Cherokee historians and Theda Purdue and others. And it was just this reminder that in his moment of betrayal or felt betrayal, and there were many of them, he felt in part that his petitions and his nation's petitions had been ignored, and that really bothered him. And the other one was that petition I read earlier, that you know, it's such a well-organized document. I'm planning to publish it. Parts of it have already been published in Lapham's Quarterly. That petition of the men of color, the Black men, freedmen of Savannah, who had just fought for the Union, who had just spilled their blood and seen, you know, their other, comrades spill theirs to support the Union cause. and are just incensed with Johnson. It is such a beautifully written document. Again, it mixes rage with meticulous organization. I've never seen anything quite like it.
Wow, thank you. For me, those are important, but I really like what you wrote about the New Echota Treaty and how the Mashpee petition really, I mean, it was really jarring. And I don't know if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, but you wrote in your book that it stands as one of the largest per capita efforts by any community in North America. And reading that sentence, it suddenly made it gigantic to me. But then I read further and I actually read the gripping, heartbreaking petition on page 161 in your book. And it just summed everything up and really coalesced really a lot of my different ideas about removal and what it must have been like for Indigenous peoples in Georgia on the ground. So thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about one of the things I grappled with, Dan, is this, I guess our instinct, because we're living right here today, we're inclined to think of petitions as maybe the weapons of the weak, dispossessed and disfranchised. And in your book, you really prove something that's maybe the opposite of that, that it's really, an instrument used by people, and then that instrument and all the other signatures, it becomes a powerful movement in its own right. So your book kind of challenges our wrong-minded view. Tell us how that works. How were you able to so eloquently demonstrate and lay out that petitions are actually one of the most important tools for our democracy in the 19th century?
Great question. I don't know if I can do it justice, but let me say a few things. I've been really inspired by the work of the Indigenous scholar Maggie Blackhawk. I've worked with her. She's now at NYU Law. And she helped me to begin to think about petitions, and especially the norm of petition and response. The idea that even when it was considered hierarchical, that a petition was always supposed to meet with a response. And that really helped me think a lot about, well, even then, and it's important not to romanticize these histories. These people were petitioning from their trauma, from their dispossession, from their enslavement, from the brutalities that had been visited upon them. And it's important to recognize that. So I'm not trying to portray the 19th century in North America as a golden age of enjoyment and freedom.
Exactly.
And that. In part, the democracy in part emerges from collective laments, collective appeals, collective complaints. But in addition to this idea that the petition was supposed to get a response, which was, I think, a pretty tightly observed norm in the 19th century, not just in Congress, but across a range of government and even ecclesiastical offices. I would say also that I began to think a little bit about, and this is in part comes from training in political science. Political scientists tend to think a lot about the concept of agendas and agenda setting. If you really want to change policy, you have to recognize that people in positions of power or positions of authority, and that could include an entire body of people like Congress, they're only debating among a menu of 3 or 4 possibilities and debating 3 or 4 issues. And a lot of times what you want to do, and this goes back to classic work by John Kingdon, Frank Baumgartner, Brian Jones, Marie Hoinaki, others, what they will suggest is that you really need to shape that agenda. The first thing you have to do is get on the radar screen of the people in power. And I think that was a really big part of it. Even people who could never hope to have much force as voters, like Native Americans, could still place their issues on the colonial agenda or the government agenda, and often with no further success. But political scientists, I think, would often regard that as a necessary first step in sort of democratization. And then the small victories that often did happen in the 19th century required putting those issues on the agenda in the first place before anything happened. I think the only other thing I would say is organization. You know, we think of democracy not just as people turning up to vote, but, you know, can you organize for your cause in a movement, in a fraternity of associations? And I'm not the first to notice this. A number of scholars of petitioning and social movements have noticed this, but the petition and the association often went hand in hand. This is something that scholars like Anne Boylan, Nancy Cott, and others have noticed of the call it the long women's movement, if you will, that I see in your work on Cincinnati and 19th century African American history and so forth. So organizations and agendas, I think, are critical.
Thank you for that. So I was thinking about moral suasion. We don't like it as much. So what's the relationship between moral suasion, which was pretty big in the abolitionist movement, and all of these petitioning campaigns? Did it play a role at all in advancing, or as you say, reshaping the agenda?
Yeah, it did. And let's remember that sometimes the most important readers of a petition are not the people to whom it's officially sent, right? So when those women, and again, you have, boys, as young as 8 in French Canada, young women at least as young as 11 or 12 in the anti-slavery movement circulating these petitions, they're persuading their family members, their church members, the people who sit with them in the same pews. That's often an interracial dynamic in many cities. Their friends and neighbors, their coworkers, things like that. And so keep in mind that the audience for moral suasion is often not just the leader that we're trying to persuade. It's always tough to say, well, what might have changed Abraham Lincoln's mind such that he became somebody who was kind of mildly anti-slavery in the sense of kind of pro-colonization to become fully embracing of the cause of emancipation, or what changed the minds of some of the say of the U.S. Senate in 1842, which revisited a fraudulent treaty and actually gave the Seneca people back 2 reservations that they had lost 4 years before. Which may seem like a small victory, but at the time it's almost unheard of for Congress to reverse a treaty and give natives their land back at that time. And I think in many respects, it's the kind of thing that you saw in that Savannah Freedman's petition. It's moral suasion, and these petitions they're not tweets. They're not, they're beautifully constructed. People gave a lot of thought to them. They're often written by committees or groups of people. They organize evidence, and ethical claims can often have evidence, or it'll have a certain degree of logic. And it's worth pointing out that there were other democratic currents of the day following the American Revolution, the revolution in Haiti, the French Revolution, other developments, the War of 1812, and the way it really undermined the British and aristocratic interests. The Mexican Revolution. There were really a currents of equality, and many of these petitioners were appealing specifically to the idea that, at root, we are all created equal. We are equal human beings. And as you noted in the anti-slavery case, they refer to the Declaration of Independence almost more than, I believe this is right, that there are more references to the Declaration of Independence during the anti-slavery movement than there are during the 1790s, right, in American culture. That need to get some facts on that. But the bottom line is, to say that this, as Dr. King would have said, this promissory note, this note of equality just simply has not been maintained. And how can any free republic coexist with slavery?
Exactly. There, I guess I have two more issues and then we'll pivot to the audience, Dan, but thank you for these responses. So you contend in your book that Seneca Falls Convention is not the genesis, it's not the end all be all, it's not the morning star of the America's women's movement. Tell us about these women in Quebec 2 decades earlier.
Yeah, this is a great point. Thank you, Nikki. And so I'm not the first person, far from the first person, to suggest that, the movements for women's empowerment and liberation, predate Seneca Falls. And I mentioned some of the names earlier. Lori Ginsburg, by the way, wrote a fantastic book on that petition of Jefferson County. Ann Boylan, and I apologize for all the names I'm forgetting, my colleague Nancy Cott and others. But it is worth, stepping outside of the boundaries and sovereignties of the United States for a minute, right? Some of the most active and radical petitioning, as you mentioned in that Cherokee case, occurs in the 1810s, by Cherokee women, by women at Mashpee who are actually represented in Mashpee's municipal electorate up until the late 1820s. So they're regularly voting. And by French Canadian women who, like other Indigenous women, are petitioning and who are voting in provincial elections. And it's more often widows who are recognized to vote in Canadian elections. But one of the strongest arguments for property-based women's suffrage emerges in a petition that comes from a coalition that is trying to push for widows' suffrage in Quebec and Montreal in 1827 and 1828, which, by the way, is the same time that the Canadians are mounting this massive petitioning effort with 85 to 90,000 signatures. So it's important, again, I think, to sometimes open our aperture beyond just what we see in the United States.
Exactly.
Things. Yeah. I
agree. Exactly. One last topic for me, and of course you knew I would mention this because you mentioned my first book, the state conventions of colored men. State conventions of colored men, some of the most prolific 19th century, thank you, some of the most prolific 19th century petitioners. And I know you don't necessarily dedicate a chapter, but if you could just, and I know you looked at all of those, but if you could just tell the audience for us how they factor into this longer arc of 19th century petitioning in particular. And most of them did it at the state level, right? So they're petitioning a different body than one would expect, their state legislatures. So
yeah, and let me emphasize, and I'm glad you mentioned that, that despite the fact that I read that Savannah Friedman's petition to Congress, one of the points that I make is, unless we think carefully about the venues of petitions, not just the US Congress, but state legislatures, we're gonna miss a lot of petitioning.
Right.
If we ignore state legislatures, we ignore the venue that Black petitioners, at least in my studies, and I think others would support this, or constitutional conventions, petitioned most. So too the Freedmen's Bureau, places like that.
Right.
Same with Native Americans who often petition the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Office of Indian Affairs, the War Department, as much or more than they ever petition Congress. What I love about that, and I think there's so much more that needs to be done. There's all the work done by people like Foner and others in this space. I know there are people who are starting to put together digitized records and databases on those conventions. And apologies, I don't have time to mention all the great scholars who are doing work there. But one of the things that I think is so fascinating about those conventions is that they're co-evolving. It's again this organization, right?
Right.
You know, associations and organizations that are co-evolving with petitions. And I think one of the other things that you see, and at the end, that same chapter that I discussed, the Savannah Friedman's petition to impeach Johnson, is, can you imagine at any point African Americans in the 19th century, free, much less enslaved, petitioning openly and radically for the impeachment of a US president? And to me, that's a moment of democracy. But it's a moment of democracy that just as Sojourner Truth begins to start petitioning campaigns for a certain kind of reparations, just as there are petitions become a venue, just one among others, where a certain kind of radical audacity emerges. And I think it's important to recognize that. We often read pamphlets, letters, we read riots, we look at party platforms, but unless we see those petitions, they're not always deferential, as you say. They're often quite radical.
Exactly, thank you. So let's pivot to the audience questions. And there's one that I think is really good. It's, how did petitioning intersect with formal politics and political parties? Did the political parties attempt to capitalize on this energy? You do discuss this in your book, but if you could just summarize it a little for the audience.
Absolutely. I want to be very clear that in this book, I do not wish to say that democracy happened by petition and not by parties and not by elections. I see much more complementarity than substitution there. I think, several things. First, often the groups that are forming new factions, groups, associations, and parties, not unlike, as you mentioned, the colored men's, freedmen's conventions of the 1860s and 1870s, as they called themselves. They are petitioning at the same time that they are forming organizations. And so, one thing I think is worth doing, it's not a universal, say, causal link, is that whenever you see a new party forming in American history at the state level or national level, you might want to look in the previous, either at the same time that party is forming or in the previous 5 to 10 years, you might want to look at petitioning activity as a herald of sorts, as a harbinger of that partisan activity. One such example would be the American Whig Party. We don't really have a competitive two-party system at the national level until the Whig Party is able to successfully contest elections at the scale of the Democrats, which does not happen in 1832. It really doesn't even happen in 1836. 1832, the Whigs aren't around, but the National Republicans cannot. It's not the entire origin of the Whig Party, but a big part of it comes from Henry Clay and his campaign against the Jackson administration's bank policies. And it's not so much that he persuaded people that the bank was such a great thing. I don't think he ever did that. He did persuade people that Jackson was behaving as a tyrant, that he was behaving unlawfully. And that formed the basis, as we show, as I've shown with my colleague Ben Schneer, and as I discuss in chapter 8, that formed the basis for the rise of an opposition party. Similar things actually happen in Upper Canada, or what is today, loosely, it's not quite, but Ontario, English, Anglophone Canada, with the rise of the Durhamites and reform interests that would oppose the Anglican orthodoxy and aristocracy there.
Okay, thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about the alliances that people would have forged that crossed socioeconomic classes and even faith?
Really good, great question. So, one of the things that I hope we start to do as we put together large databases of these petitions is to examine who signed them. We often, I think there's been a generation of historians and even some political scientists who have rightly regarded the anti-slavery movement as kind of rent asunder in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s. But what you'll often see in these anti-slavery petitions is conservatives and radicals signing the same petition, their names on the same page. You'll find in the Massachusetts campaign for women's suffrage in the early 1850s that Joelle Million has written about and other historians have written about. you will find women and men signing the same documents. And you see that with the Declaration at Seneca Falls as well. You'll find Quakers signing alongside Native Americans as the Quakers contest dispossession. You will find many times men signing, on behalf of women. There are limits, however. So there are petitions where African-American signatories and white signatories sign alongside one another, but there are often many cases in which they sign separately, in part because that was a major social risk for bodily risk, physical risk for African-Americans to kind of cross the racial line in those cases. So you see that, for instance, in Pennsylvania in the 1840s and 1850s. There's a disenfranchisement law that passes Pennsylvania. There are a number of other similar civil rights initiatives that Kate Mazur has recently written about in her book, Until Justice Be Done. And in some cases, you'll see Black and white people signing the same petitions. But in other cases, the signatory communities are quite segregated. And I think that points to me to the boldness and risk that people took when they did cross these lines of class, race, indigeneity, and faith. That was not an easy thing to do.
Okay, thank you. Another question, Dan. Could you talk about the problem of what happens when historians have defined equality and democracy, i.e. in the Jacksonian period, as applicable to such a limited group of citizens? And how has this way of thinking about democracy erased and or marginalized a more expansive understanding of democracy or democratic subjects in the 19th century?
Excellent question. I should say that if anybody's as a technically trained political scientist, I would say that political scientists are every bit as guilty, if not more so, than historians of equating kind of Jacksonian democracy and the democracy of, if you will, the white man's republic of the 1820s, 1830s, and so forth, with democratization. I think there's been a long a set of assumptions and narratives that have gone into that. I do want to say that this is not an argument, let me just, before I get to the meat of the question, this is not an argument that there weren't real achievements in the Jacksonian period, or I think today would be more proper to say before the Jacksonian period, say the 1810s, when the right to vote, for instance, is untethered from property owning. That's really significant. That's in many cases, within different marginalized communities, people see that kind of Jeffersonian small d democratic promise there, and they see that as an aspiration. But yes, it's all too true that if we just restrict democracy to that, we end up unable, in my opinion, to persuasively explain the contestation of the global slave system,
right,
in its eventual abolition. We are unable to describe the mobilization, demobilization, and remobilization of women. And in part, I think, I would say two things. Number one, we need to listen to these neglected voices in American and North American history more generally. And obviously there's a much wider movement, debate that long predates me and will long outlast this book that already does that, led by historians of color and others that I think is very important. The other thing I think, we can't understand the fears that gripped Southern slaveholders in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, without understanding the fact that they were scared that Black people were petitioning. Not just free Black people in the North, but also free Black people and free people of color in the Caribbean. There's a petition I spent some time on where South Carolina's white citizens basically call for the expulsion of all free Blacks from the state. And the reason they do that is they say, look at what's going on right now in the British West Indies. Look at all these people of color petitioning for civil equality, legal equality. This is dangerous. And so they, white citizens, petition their own white representatives and office holders and say, we need to do something about this. And I can tell a similar story when, land company interests and speculators are upset that Native Americans are contesting removal. And when Southern members of Congress are upset that, African-American women are contesting slavery, or in the North, different forms of apartheid. And so in part, in order to understand the actions of even the powerful, we have to understand the way that they were confused by, outraged by, and strategically responded to the actions of the marginalized. It's important, yes, I think to honor and to showcase the actions of the marginalized themselves. That's reason enough.
Right.
But we also miss the larger complicated dynamics of power if we also ignore those voices.
Yeah, I think that's why using the petitions as a source really does allow for a wider lens and a more inclusive vision of the democracy, even as it was, being worked out. And so I really appreciated that about your book, that it expanded it to hear the voices. And one thing you pointed out in the book is that these petitions as historical documents really do illuminate the grievances, the heartbreaking grievances of the regular people, the people who are not legislators or leaders or city leaders. And so, yes, that definitely is a more inclusive vision of democracy, just using petitions as a source.
And let me add, I'm sorry, you probably get, but let me just add, that's another reason not just to focus on parties, party platforms, and ballots.
Right.
Because
exactly.
Not all a ballot is usually a vote for one candidate or another. So, in the era that I'm talking about, we're not talking about plebiscitary petitions where we vote on a proposition. The ballot is, is it person A or person B for this office? And that there's no room for complaint making, no room for lamentation, no room for the portrayal of trauma in it, right? And that's why the petitions are so crucial.
Right, and they say a lot more too, Dan, about just American life and society in that moment as well, not just about the political strivings or the strivings towards equality or citizenship, but just about their day-to-day struggles, their family and community lives, and what animated them, even as they lived their day-to-day lives. So it looks like a lot of the questions that remain in the last few minutes are about the present. And so I'll try, of course, even though in your afterword, you bluntly answer the predictable question of whether petitioning could be resurrected today. And you so bluntly say, no anachronistic resurrection of the petitioning culture of 19th century North America is possible or desirable. And then you use very strong language. Only a fool would surrender the right to vote to the right to petition. It's all true, but let's try to answer some of the grays or ponder the grays about that. What place does 21st century petitioning play in our democracy, if anything at all? We're thinking of change.org, Move On, and all of these others. Are they still valid or viable? Can they still be effective, in your opinion? And then the last part of that is, have online petitions where you just click and the form is already filled out, have those become too cheap to even be considered a real instrument of political power?
Excellent questions, Nikki, and thanks to the audience for those. I don't want to suggest that the world I'm describing in 19th century North America can never again exist. I do want to suggest, as I put it, yes, kind of bluntly at the end, you know, especially right now in the midst of these, you know, critical contests over the equality of the vote, as we see state governments and governments worldwide repressing the vote. I do not want to be suggesting that, okay, it's okay, we've got petitions, it's all good there. It's not.
Right.
And in part, it's important to keep in mind that even those earlier triumphs of the extension of suffrage rights and the crafting of suffrage rights depended in part on petitioning campaigns, in no small part. But I think the problem we have right now is that at some level we've lost the mechanisms and the norm of petition and response. And I get back to Professor Maggie Blackhawk's work here. I can sign one of those petitions online, change.org, moveon.org. Unlike the petition that the Savannah Freedmen sent, or the petition that those 6 women sent, or the petition that the Innu sent to the Governor General of Canada, there's not an expected response by any official of government. You know, and so in the petition of yesteryear has been replaced less in part by the online petition than by the lawsuit, right? Where we kind of get our day in court. And I think that's at some level valuable. The ability to sue somebody who you know, has aggrieved us or injured us is crucial. It's not a very public process. It's dominated by the practitioners of law and all the inequalities that we see there. You know, it's theoretically open to everybody, but you better have a good lawyer, is kind of, I think, the way that we often think about that. There are some, you know, I think instead of thinking about reclaiming petitioning, you know, itself, although I do think, you know, valuable things can happen when petitions are carried door to door and signed in person. There's a number of recent studies that suggest that actually can be a mobilizing and energizing device. So, you know, and many petitions still are signed in person, but that may be better for civic engagement. The only other thing I would say is that I think we need to look at, you know, forms of complaint making and forms of agenda setting. And there, you know, I don't want to draw any direct line between, you know, democracy by petition in the 19th century and contemporary social movements. Right. They're quite different. And yet at the same time, in a world with television, social media, you know, the ability to organize in-person rallies and protests, at some level, much of that work, imperfectly, and I think we've really lost something, does now fall to social movements. And of course, in some ways, they can do things that other people couldn't. You know, look what the video camera or the smartphone camera has done for social movements in recent years.
Thank you so much, Dan. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Democracy by Petition, Popular Politics and Transformation, 1790 to 1870. That concludes our program for today. I want to thank Dan again for his reading and engaging conversation, and our audience for their terrific and pointed questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week, along with the recordings from other past events. For information about upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs, including the final book talk of the summer on Tuesday, August 17th, a discussion of the 50th anniversary of the first edition of Our Bodies, Ourselves, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a nice evening.